start, as we have so many events today. Unfortunately, we have to squeeze Kevin in, and I'm really delighted to have Kevin here. He's a very good friend of mine, colleague for years. We work together on things, although we have some different research interests. We somehow occasionally find a common point of agreement. So Kevin is both sociologist and political theorist who is interested in various topics, social exclusion, domination, power, citizenship, even playgrounds. He's done a very interesting study of playgrounds through time. He's author of two books, Social Exclusion and Politics of Order, Manchester University Press, and more recently an edited volume with archival on political power for IPSA. He's written many articles and chapters on various topics, so today's topic will be very interesting because it focuses, it's a sort of a new area of research using this, but in some respects it's also sort of something that you do for many years. So it's competition and control in the enterprise society, social life as a sporting contest. So,
thanks, Sanisha. Thanks for coming. I got an email from Sanisha last week telling me everything was going on in UCB and Trinity today, and I figured I'd give you this paper to Sanisha over a coffee. And just to say that we still miss him in Galway. He's sorely missed. As I say, I'm not going to use PowerPoints, I just want to use a short video clip in a moment and then I'll close this down. But when I started working on the paper, it's actually closer to home, not so much really about sport. I was looking for a way of thinking critically about the power of numbers, I suppose. Audits, metrics, measured performance, KPIs, key performance indicators. I'm not sure what the situation in UCD is, but in NUI Galway, this year we've adopted a performance management and development system. So we're going to be going through this annual review process where our performance is assessed and we're ranked. During the negotiation before last summer this was ongoing between management and union reps, this came up for some discussion during a school meeting. So this was the beginning of last summer and there was a group of us sitting around like this. And I wouldn't say it was quite an argument, but it was getting there. The debate got very heated and two positions quickly emerged. One is that one position that measuring performance is a way of recognizing and rewarding excellence. And the other that actually it's a type of surveillance and discipline, that it's more stick than carrot. And I think this sort of gets to the heart of the issue, because actually it depends. If you're publishing in top journals, if you're putting in research money, the teaching is going really well and so forth, then of course you're going to shine under the spotlight of this type of an audit. But this is ultimately a relational type of accounting. And ultimately it depends on who you're working alongside. Two people doing the same volume of work, the same quality of work in two institutions might be ranked very differently. And if you're working alongside a group of high achievers, maybe you've got young kids, maybe you've got a life outside of work, it's going to be hard to keep up. You know, you can imagine that it's quite easy that you would appear very average, or worse, that your line manager is going to call you in for a meeting and say that you're not pulling your weight. So it seems to me that to be governed in this way is to be in a type of a race, but it's a race without a finish line. And that's kind of what we got thinking about that famous line from Max Weber, where he looks to the future. In fact, he's looking to the United States, and he sees the pursuit of wealth stripped of all religious and ethical meaning. And he says, well, it takes on the character of sport. So coming back to the power of numbers, and some people have published on this, called it new managerialism. Some of the critical literature that I've looked at sees this as a sort of a process of colonization. And I think there's a similarity there with Habermas's work, the colonization of the life world by the system. So viewed in this way, the problem is the ongoing process of neoliberalization, the interfacing of competition and new forms of control. But I wanted to pose a slightly different question. So my question isn't whether the logic of the market is encroaching on arenas such as health and education. I'm more interested in how competition itself has changed and the way that competition has intensified. And that's why I decided to look at sport, and specifically at the world of professional cycling. So I'm going to talk a little bit around the case of Lance Armstrong. I don't know whether anybody has any interest in this. It was in the news a lot last year. So I have a short video clip that I'm going to use just to sort of contextualise this. It's about 4.5 minutes long. So if I could just play that.
I don't think Armstrong can get round it. He's making absolutely no impression. Lance Armstrong is going to be beaten. And Uchikov for the Ukraine gets the victory on this stage of the Tour de France. And that is absolutely amazing.
Were you surprised? In 1996, he was diagnosed with testicular cancer. It had already spread to his stomach and lungs and was moving towards his brain. His sponsors covered this, according to Armstrong's version of events, tried to renegotiate his contract during his treatment before dropping him. Armstrong had been given at best a 40% chance of survival.
Well, at first I was so surprised that I didn't believe it. I thought I was going to die. To live the nightmare that I lived, I've been to hell and back. I realized the importance of me winning the Tour, me trying to win the Tour, what it does for everybody involved. For the cancer community, for the team, for my family, for my friends. It's fantastic.
Well, since his cancer therapy and his chemotherapy, he has lost an awful lot of weight in his training and his comeback. Those that thought after his Paris-Nice race last year that he was going home for good were proved absolutely wrong.
And now he's coming up to the line, and look at that, he's almost a minute faster on the finish line as well.
Well, we are going to see a second stage win here, and the second time trial win for Lance Armstrong, and it could well be a yellow jersey as well. Armstrong 1:8:36, an incredible time.
Well, that's an incredible start to the Tour de France, Phil. He's back in the camping car. Everybody's there to congratulate him. Frankie Andreu, his 8th Tour de France, the captain of the team, and Johan Brunel, the team manager. I don't think he could have believed that before the start of this tour.
Well, what a start for Brunel. Indurain did 8 minutes 12 seconds over this course in 1993, and now Lance has gone 10 seconds quicker.
Of course it's a big story, but for the moment we're so pleased. It's unbelievable.
You say surprised, 7 seconds over the second place man over less than 7 kilometres. That is pretty surprising going.
Yeah, that's all I know. I don't know the time, so I saw it. I didn't look at my time the whole course, and then I knew before I started the best time was 8:20, and I came across the line and I saw right around 8 minutes, and I thought, man, this can't be right.
Escartine and Gotti are the two riders out in front, but the acceleration of Armstrong is absolutely frightening here. This is the sort of move that you would have seen Eddie Merckx do in his day, and not the sort of move we ever saw Miguel Indurain do.
As he said, cancer has never met anyone like me before. During his recovery, friends noticed changes to his riding style. He was too weak to push really big gears uphill, so he pedalled small ones faster. This has meant that he could accelerate suddenly on climbs, leaving his rivals on the big gear floundering. In 1999, Armstrong won his first Tour with an astonishing blitz over 6 climbs in one day on the way to Sestriere. It was an angry ride, like Merckx's on the Tourmalet in 1969. Fueled by the way he had been treated by the European teams when he was on his sickbed.
Well, there's not much left to win the Tour de France. Armstrong now has destroyed the field. He has spread them across the mountain by the best part of an hour today. A number of riders have given up, and the arms go up in salute. Lance Armstrong looks to the sky, no doubt in memory of his friend.
Hey, I'm not on drugs. I thought a rider with my history, my health situation, and also with the results of my career, I would have thought it shouldn't be such a surprise. Okay, I was surprised to have certain good days, but I'm not a new rider, and I'm sure that there's been some looking and prying and digging. I know there has been, but it's been a week and nothing's been found. You're not going to find anything If it's L'Equipe, if it's Channel 4, if it's a Spanish paper, Dutch paper, Belgian paper, there's nothing to find. And I think once everybody gets done doing their due diligence, and once everybody realizes that they need to be professionals and they can't print a bunch of crap, then they'll realize that they're dealing with I mean, it's unfortunate that the yellow jersey of the Tour de France always has to defend drugs, or or say something about drugs. But it's not it.
Everybody wants to know what I'm on. What am I on? I'm on my bike, busting my ass 6 hours a day. What are you on?
And look at this.
So that's from a documentary called The Official History of the Tour de France, which was released in 2003 to mark the centenary of the race, which is a bit embarrassing now. The idea of an official history. 9 years later, October 2012, the United States Anti-Doping Agency announced what's called a reasoned decision. So they had no definitive proof, but they had a mountain of evidence, a lot of it circumstantial, that Armstrong had used performance-enhancing drugs throughout his career. So he was banned from competition for life, and his 7 Tour de France victories were taken away from him, so he was removed from the record books. So at the time, he continued to deny the use of banned substances. But the following January, so now it's January 2013, he agreed to be interviewed by Oprah Winfrey. And she began the interview with a series of yes-no questions. So she said, did you take erythropoietin, EPO, which is a blood booster? And he said, yes. Did you take human growth hormone? Yes. Testosterone? Yes. And on it went from there. So on that video clip, you get a sort of a sketch of the Armstrong legend, diagnosed with cancer in 1996. Against the odds, he survived. Not only that, but he went on to do the seemingly impossible by winning the Tour de France a record 7 times. And these were 7 consecutive wins from 1999 to 2005. Since 1903, which was the first edition of the race, 4 riders have managed to win the Tour de France 5 times. And only one of those has won it consecutively. So Armstrong did something which nobody perceived was humanly possible. A lot of people were suspicious, of course. How could he have done what nobody else was able to do? And this is also part of the myth, because we think back to the video, you hear one of the commentators saying, remarking on his physical transformation post-cancer. He'd lost weight, so he had to pedal faster, but this meant he could also accelerate quicker. And because he was lighter, he was much better in the high mountains, because climbing on a bike is all about power to weight. And in his autobiography, published in 2001, Armstrong tells the story of his cancer as a sort of a rebirth. Cancer changed him physically, mentally, emotionally. So it's a story which is a bit like a phoenix rising from the ashes. And he was, in his own words, better. Not just cured of the cancer, but improved, enhanced. Now this body weight myth has actually been disputed by analysts, because the cocktail of drugs he was on would have reduced his body fat, but increased lean muscle, so he would have looked slimmer, but not necessarily lighter. And in the ad you also see, or this clip you also see this ad, what am I on? I'm on my bike busting my ass 6 hours a day. That ad was paid for by Nike. I think this is where it starts to get interesting, and in 2 ways. First is the punishment that was served against Armstrong. In his own words, he's been given a life sentence, banned for life. He cheated, he lied, and he got caught. But numerous others have done the same thing, and typically they get a 2-year suspension, certainly for the first offence. So there was something unusual about the punishment that was dished out to Armstrong. So the question here is why? Why did he get a life sentence? And I'll suggest a tentative answer to that a little bit later. The second thing is the nature of these sanctions more generally, which is about punishing individuals. Not just athletes like Armstrong, but also sports doctors or individuals who are seen to be implicated in the provision or administration of banned substances. But you might say, well, what about Nike and many other corporations and companies that had a stake in the Armstrong enterprise? So the issue here is that the enhanced athlete is part of a network of of expertise and a network of interests. So I'm approaching this by looking at it in 3 dimensions, and one dimension is the historical dimension. And this concerns the gradual interlacing of sport, science, politics, commerce. And really this is most salient during the post-war period, so from about 1945, 1950 onwards. The vision of the Olympic movement, of course, was a world united by sport, but the reality was very different. The sport became a sort of an ideological variable in the Cold War, in the context of the Cold War. And the science of performance, including the use of drugs, was a weapon in this sporting version of the arms race. There's also the commercialization of sport, the financial rewards attached to winning, the investment sponsors make, the involvement of media corporations such as Eurosport and B-Sky B. So I'm going to touch on some of that in the paper, but I don't have time to really unpack that historical dimension in a lot of detail. So I'll just say a few things about the history of drugs in sport. And this only became a problem quite recently, during the 1960s. The first conference on what was called the biological preparation of the athlete was held in 61 or 62. And laws prohibiting the use of substances, the non-medical use of medical substances, were introduced from the late 60s through to the early 70s. So it wasn't that it's not that drugs weren't being used in sport. Drugs have been used as long as there has been sport, and certainly in the case of cycling, it's just that they weren't prohibited. And there's a well-known story from the 1924 Tour de France. So 2 French riders, who were brothers, dropped out of the race, and this was their way of protesting against new regulations, which they claimed made the already excessive demands of racing the Tour de France simply intolerable. And they gave an interview to a journalist called Albert Landry. During the interview, they emptied their pockets and they showed Landry all of the drugs they had to take in order to survive the race. These drugs are for our eyes, these drugs are for our lungs. And there was a whole variety of drugs that they had to use. And Landry was just back from reporting on the penal colony in French Guiana. And he used this as a sort of an interpretive lens to examine the suffering of the professional cyclists. And he published his article under the heading, "Convict Labourers of the Road." So at that time, professional cycling was portrayed as a type of manual labour. And the drugs were evidence of how exploitative the life of the pedal worker, as they were called, was. So we have this sort of transformation from drugs as a normal, even necessary part of sport, to drugs as a problem, which requires intrusive controls, strict controls. So today the problem of drugs in sport is framed really in 3 ways. There are 3 arguments. The drugs are dangerous, so they have to be regulated or controlled to preserve or protect the health of the athletes. Drugs are unethical because the doped athlete has an unfair advantage on the clean athlete. And finally, the doping violates what's called the spirit of sport, playing true and playing fair. And that last one, the spirit of sport, has really come to the fore in recent years, particularly since the establishment of the World Anti-Doping Authority. And this was created in 1999. There's an interesting story in how this came about, which I won't go into, but basically what was happening was the intrusion of political actors into the authority of the International Olympics Committee. So political actors were muscling their way into what had previously been an in-house problem. And the outcome of this was the creation of the World Anti-Doping Authority. So anyway, this spirit of sport, the WADA, the World Anti-Doping Authority, has written this into what it calls its fundamental rationale in the fight against doping in sport. And they use this idea of a sporting spirit as a sort of an umbrella term. So this now incorporates the other 2 arguments, the health issue and the ethical issue. But it also includes what's called excellence in performance. That's part of the sporting spirit as well. So there's a sort of a tricky balancing act going on here. And it's a tension that goes all the way back to the revival, the rebirth of the Olympics in 1896. So on the one hand, you have the informal value of participation. It's not the winning that counts, it's the taking part. And on the other hand, you have the official motto of the Olympic movement, which is faster, higher, stronger, which lays the emphasis on excelling and succeeding. And this tension has been shaped by this interlacing of these processes of science, politics and commerce, and the way this has shaped the meaning of sport throughout the 20th century. So what's happened really is that the value of participation now counts for very little. Winning is everything. And drugs are a really effective way of gaining an edge over your rivals. So I mentioned 3 dimensions of the analysis. So there's that historical dimension, which I've just sort of very briefly sketched. The other 2 are conjunctural. So one is what athletes do to enhance performance, and I call this dialing the numbers. And the other is what anti-doping authorities do to try to control the enhancing of performance. So I'll start with how athletes dial the numbers. Now in the past, the drugs that cyclists, certainly cyclists, would have used were either stimulants like amphetamines, or pain suppressants, or a combination of both. The technique of blood boosting, using blood transfusions, isn't new. This was developed, it was really pioneered by East Germany and the Soviet bloc during the Cold War. It was then mimicked by the United States. So the technique was developed through the 70s into the early 80s, and then it was banned by the International Olympics Committee. But it was the arrival of EPO, erythropoietin, into the world of professional sport that proved to be a game changer. So this drug was developed as a way of treating anemia. And cyclists use it to boost their red blood cell count. So this is basically a way of enriching the body's fuel, if you like. It's a way of delivering more oxygen to the muscles. And when used in conjunction with hormones and steroids, it enables racing cyclists to train harder and to recover faster. So it increases speed, it increases strength, it increases endurance. So this is not just about getting a pep or a lift on the day of the race. It has a lot more to do with preparation and training. Okay. These are the performance-enhancing effects. And working in tandem with these new high-octane drugs, as they're called, is the science of performance, which is bringing to the power of numbers, because this is a language of numbers. In his book, Armstrong recalls going into the performance lab at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. So he went into the lab with his coach, Chris Carmichael, and they set him up on a stationary bicycle. So it's a machine that can be used to vary the resistance load as the cyclist works. So in other words, you're simulating hills and headwinds and that kind of thing to make it harder. And they fitted him with all sorts of electrodes and hooked him up to all sorts of machines. So they were measuring his heart rate. They were measuring his power output, which is measured in watts. They were mapping his lactate curve, finding out the threshold, the point at which the body produces lactic acid faster than it can remove it. Testing his VO2 max, which is the volume of oxygen that the body takes in when it's working at maximum capacity. So what they were doing was they were really drawing a diagram of these physical parameters, not just for his strengths, but also for his weaknesses and his limitations. And all of this was information that could be used by his coach and his doctor in order to tailor his training and his medication. So, if you think about this, is Armstrong telling his story. This is how I approached the challenge of trying to win the Tour de France. But actually it's not his story, because this is how it's done now. This is how elite athletes prepare for competition. And actually it's not even elite athletes. I know very, very average amateur cyclists in the west of Ireland who do this. Not the drugs maybe, but just about everything else. And almost like this enslavement to the numbers. Transforming your ability and your potential into numbers, and then trying to figure out how to dial the numbers, how to make those numbers look better, how to improve it. And Armstrong applied the same attitude to his kit and equipment, so he adopted what he called the Formula One approach. And what he did is he brought all of his sponsors together in a bid to coordinate research, and said, look, you guys have to integrate everything. I want the best of what's technically possible. And I want the way that the body interfaces with the machine, even the clothing. I want all of this to function as a singular and seamless system. And his doctor, Michele Ferrari, like Armstrong, was fluent in the science of performance, the language of numbers. Ferrari's clients were basically spreadsheets with numbers representing the percentage of body fat, their weight, their wattage, their hematocrit, which is a number that represents the volume of red blood cells. And Ferrari also came up with the magic number 7.6, which means 7.6 watts of power per kilogram of body weight. According to his calculations, that's what you needed. That was the target if you wanted to win the Tour de France. So hitting that target would require very structured training. It would require all of that information generated through the lab work, careful attention to the smallest detail regarding everything from nutrition to clothing to shoes, every component on the bicycle. And when it came to the drugs, Ferrari proved to be a real innovator as well. For a long time there was no test for EPO. So what the UCI, the International Cycling Union, did was it looked at it came up with a population goal. It said that the upper level of a normal hematocrit or red blood cell count is 50. So if a cyclist exceeds 50, then we'll take them out and we'll suspend them for a couple of weeks on health grounds, even though we can't prove that they're taking drugs. But that just became a license to dope up to that level. You know, if you had a hematocrit of 42 or 43, it meant you could dope safely until you approached the 50 mark. So when they finally did introduce a test for EPO, Ferrari just adapted and invented a tea called microdosing. So they would just take very small amounts of EPO more regularly, and this decreased what's called the glow time, the time in which it's possible to detect the presence of these drugs in the body. And when the testing was refined, and apparently it's really expensive to test for EPO, it takes days, and it's not terribly reliable in a lot of cases. But when the testing was refined, Ferrari simply adapted again. He went back to the technique of blood transfusions. So they take blood out of the athletes coming up to a big race like the Tour de France, refrigerate it, and then reinfuse it during the race. An athlete would secretly get a blood bag in the second week and the third week. But enhancing performance isn't just about the drugs. Even the helmets that cyclists race in, which used to be about safety, are now marketed on how many watts they save the cyclists riding at X or Y kilometers per hour. There's also telemetry, which crossed over from motor racing during the 90s. So one feature of this is two-way radios, wireless radios, connecting the team car to the cyclist. On that video clip, roughly towards the end, we saw this piece where Armstrong is attacking on one of the mountains, and he's blowing the field apart. So he's climbing a really steep mountain, 18, 20 kilometers long, at about 30 kilometers an hour, and nobody can keep up. His team director, Johan Brunel, was communicating with him through two-way radio all the way through that attack, telling him what was happening on the road, what was happening to his rivals. He also had a heart rate monitor hooked up to that transmitter. So they had a laptop computer in the car, and they were able to monitor his heart rate as well. And they knew that he was within his comfort zone. He was in control. There was no danger. So all of this information is transmitted back to the car. The team director is issuing tactical commands via radio, not just to Armstrong, but to the team. So the riders become, in a sense, drones, and the racing is done by remote control. There are other ways of playing the numbers game as well, which, the financial rewards attached to winning. At the height of his career in 2004, it's estimated that Armstrong was earning somewhere in the region of $4.5 million US in salary, and an additional 10 million in bonus money, and something like 16.5 million in endorsements. And that bonus money had been negotiated 4 years earlier. So this was when he'd already won 2 Tour de France's, so his market value had gone up. And he sat down and negotiated a contract with Tailwind Sports. Tailwind was the company that owned the team that he raced for, which was sponsored by the US Postal Service. Okay, so the US Postal were the sponsors, Tailwind was the company that owned the team. Armstrong was working for Tailwind, and he negotiated a contract. So the deal was that he'd get a bonus of $4.5 million if he equaled the record of 5 Tour de France wins. So if you match the record thus far, you get a payout of $4.5 million. If you win a 6th, which has never been done, an additional 5 million. Now Tailwind sold the risk to a company called SCA Promotions. This is a Dallas-based insurance company that specialises in big prizes, things like a hole-in-one at a golf tournament. So Tailwind negotiated the contract, sold the risk to SCA, and things got a bit messy when Armstrong did in fact go on to win that 6th tour because SCA didn't want to pay out. So at that stage the allegations of doping gave them traction and they took it to arbitration, but they lost. Armstrong got paid. And there's lots more that could be said here. The United States Postal Service itself, I haven't been able to verify the figure, but a couple of Wall Street journalists who wrote a book on Armstrong last year, and they followed the money. They reckon that the US Postal, when it got into cycling, had an annual turnover of 50 billion per annum. It sounds a lot, I don't know whether that's a credible figure, but only about 3% of that was from overseas business. The rest was from within the United States, and they wanted to grow their product internationally. So when they got into cycling, when they invested in the cycling team that went on to win the Tour de France 7 times, the exposure they got was incredible. And by their own account, they did enormously well out of it. And the investment was just a fraction of their advertising budget anyway. The company Trek, it's an American bicycle company, and they provided Armstrong's teams with top-end carbon fibre frames. These things cost in the region of 4 or 5 grand a piece. They trebled the size of their business through their involvement with Armstrong. The Discovery Channel was invested, I think, 31 or 32 million in a 4-year deal, starting in 2004-2005. Again, by their own account, they made over 100 million in the first year of that deal alone. That's the return they got from it. And you could easily add to the list. There's Nike, there's Oakley, the various sponsors that Armstrong was involved in. So the point I'm stressing here is this, that the enhanced athlete is plugged in to a web of expertise, and in turn this web of expertise is plugged in to a whole network of business interests. So moving to the question of control, how do anti-doping authorities try to regulate or control enhanced performance? I just want to look briefly at a couple of instruments that are used both by WADA, the World Anti-Doping Authority, and also by the UCI, the International Cycling Union, which is the world governing body for cycle sport. So this is the whereabouts system and what's called the biological passport. So the way the whereabouts system works is that athletes are required to notify the relevant anti-doping authority of their whereabouts. So it does exactly what it says on the tin. And the thing about these new drugs, these new, like EPO, is that they're only detectable for a very short amount of time. The effects far outlast the presence of the drug in the body. So anti-doping authorities today conduct out-of-competition testing, hence they need to know the whereabouts of the athlete. So it's partly about detection, but it's also about deterrence, because it's a way of subjecting athletes to panoptic power. And I'm thinking of Foucault's work on discipline and self-government. The possibility of being tested out of competition means that the doping control officer is both real and imaginary. It's a way of planting a warning message in the mind of the athlete. There's 2 other features as well which are worth noting. One is that this is reconfigured sanctions, because an athlete can be sanctioned without ever testing positive for a banned substance. You can be sanctioned for failing to provide accurate information of your whereabouts. You can be sanctioned for failing to show up for a test. So a combination of inaccurate information and missed tests is sufficient to suspend an athlete from competition. The second issue, I think, which is an exemplary feature of panoptic power, is that the whereabouts game is framed as a flexible tool that enables top-level athletes to show their commitment to doping-free sport. And that's a quote from the WADA. In other words, this is about the voluntary acceptance of imposed obligations. And I'll come back to that in a minute with the help of an example. The second instrument, the biological passport. I think the word passport itself is interesting because we typically associate this with movement across state borders, use of the passport. The biological passport is no different really in that it governs access to particular sports. So this is basically an electronic document that records test results, so blood and urine samples from tests that are conducted both in competition and out of competition. And what it does is it plots these over time and creates a sort of a graph. which is like a baseline, the individual's biological profile. And what it's looking for is deviations from the normal range for that individual. So basically there's a spike in the graph, and that's cause for suspicion. And this also black boxes the policing of athletes, a combination of information technology, sophisticated diagnostic tools, and also very specialist knowledge. There are actually relatively few people involved in the sport that are capable of interpreting that kind of data. So control and enforcement will move further into the lab and deeper into the realm of information technology. So between the whereabouts system and the biological passport, we have what's been called a drugs detection game. And this makes the old binary logic of guilt versus innocence pretty obsolete. The old technique, this new technique of continuous monitoring overcomes one of the main inertias of the old system, which is an inconclusive test. So you tested the athlete, but it's not conclusive. You're suspicious, but you can't prove it. So what this new system does is it transforms suspicion into a quantifiable risk. And the quantifiable risk in turn can be translated into a targeted action. And these new controls also construct the idea of a data double. So the athlete's body is coded, and this coded double is analysed at a distance from the physical presence of the athlete. And the athlete contributes to this doubling of his or herself by having to constantly interface with the system and update it on one's whereabouts. So the data management system stores the athlete's biopassport, and it also sources information from elsewhere: customs, policing, Interpol, pharmaceutical companies that have agreed to cooperate with the anti-doping authorities, testing labs. So it's gathering all of that information. And this pool of information is used to generate patterns and relationships, to look for, the cause for suspicion, in which case the system triggers an intervention. And I think this element of suspicion is interesting, partly because it's now such a routine feature of social life. It's why the performance of workers is measured and monitored. It's also why welfare recipients have been recoded as job seekers. To be in receipt of welfare, you have to provide evidence that you're actively seeking work. So suspicion has been sort of generalized. And in the case of athletes, there's been a sort of an interesting development in the wake of USADA's decision against Armstrong. Last year, when the Kenyan rider Chris Froome won the Tour de France, and he basically came out of nowhere, he never won a big race before. The public reaction was one of very, very vocal suspicion. At the end of last summer, the American rider Chris Horner, having lost most of the season to injury, became the oldest rider in the history of the sport to win a Grand Tour 3-week race at the age of 41. And again, disbelief. He hasn't even raced this season. How can you win one of these races if you're not taking drugs? And the response from both of these guys was to make their data public, put their data into the public domain, and therefore prove that they weren't doping. So this was like a way of staging a public relations counterattack. It's a bit like swearing an oath to the principle of transparency or something. But again, you get a sense of how people succumb to this voluntary acceptance of imposed obligations. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here, looking at what athletes do and what the anti-doping authorities do in response, is to look at the symmetry between the techniques employed by the athletes and the techniques employed by the anti-doping authorities. Both sides of the relation are focused on managing performance by playing a numbers game. And there's also a symmetry in the way that both sides of the relation play a tactical game of enterprise and innovation. And it seems to me that this is an intensely reflexive process. It's like a series of folds. Anti-doping authorities are engaged in the struggle to control the behaviour of athletes, who in turn compete in a race against each other to try to gain an edge over rivals, so that the game becomes an ongoing contest between competition and control. So just a few concluding points. After Armstrong's admission on the Oprah Winfrey Network that he had taken all these banned substances, SCA Promotions, the bonus money I mentioned, they filed a lawsuit. They want their money back. He cheated to win the Tour de France, and therefore he cheated SCA Promotions. It's fair enough. But you could also argue that SCA took the bet because they believed the odds were in their favour. They're contesting how the game was played, they're not contesting the game itself. I sometimes think of Susan Strange's notion of casino capitalism. SCA is involved in casino capitalism. I think Armstrong's rigging of the game resonates with other scandals. I mean, it's not hard to think of examples. The banking crisis, the News International phone hacking scandal, inquiries going on in Britain, the food fraud controversy in Europe last year, the horse meat and beef burgers. These are the excesses of the enterprise society. I'm not saying those issues are equivalent, and I'm certainly not condoning the behaviours of predatory bankers and predatory journalists, or drug-taking athletes for that matter. But you can't really overlook the fact that many of our students take Adderall to prepare for exams. I was talking to a PhD student from Sweden a couple of weeks ago. He tells me that his peers are taking beta blockers when they present their work at conferences, which kind of surprised me, so I looked it up. I came across an article from the New York Times from a couple of years ago, and there was a debate which was sparked by the journal Nature. A couple of Cambridge University researchers said that, well, there were 10 or 11 of their colleagues that were using cognitive enhancers on a regular basis to improve their performance at work. So there's something sort of generalised about what's going on here, which is not unique to the world of sport. So my point here is that these are the excesses of the enterprise society, and the problem is structure. You can't solve this by punishing individuals or so-called rogue companies. So to come back to the question I posed earlier, why did Armstrong get a life sentence? It's not that he cheated and it's not that he lied. Lots of other people have done that as well. What he did, I think, was embarrass the spirit of sport by taking hold of the excesses that inhabit that idea, excesses that are generally tolerated within certain limits, subject to a degree of regulation and control. And he played the game as if there were no limits. It's like saying, well, if you dispense with the notion of limits altogether, what can we do with this system? How can we gain an edge over our rivals? And when you look at the fact that he won 7 Tours de France in a row, you have to say that he did his job very well in that respect. So as a networked athlete, or as an enhanced athlete, he took the spirit of enterprise to its logical conclusion. In other words, he took the unsavoury aspects of win-at-all-cost competition and turned that into a successful enterprise, a winning blend of innovation and organisation. And the final point, I think focusing on people like Lance Armstrong can be a bit of a distraction, because in the game of enterprise, not just in the little world of professional cycling, but society more generally, most of the struggle is to stay in the game. The pool of talent is generally bigger than the requirements of the organisation, and this creates enormous pressure to try and find a way to stand out. So when you have to survive periodic audits, research assessment exercises, performance review process, all these sorts of things, then it becomes a race just to stay in the race. Selection and survival go hand in hand. So it's not just about winning, it's also about not losing, or at least not falling too far behind. And that's basically it.
Thanks very much. Okay, so questions and comments?
Where can I get my hands on these cognitive enhancers? Sounds good.
They crossed my mind as well when you said that. So,
the whole time I was thinking about the work of Austin Fabler, who might give me a better reference than Max Weber, because he wrote this famous book about business enterprise in recent times. People about conspicuous consumption. He talked about all the abolishment of knowledge that is in one way or another more useful on the shop floor, replaced by paper shufflers and supervisors. I mean, the work is full of it. I just wonder, are you familiar with it?
I'm not really familiar with his work, to be honest. I know the name, but I'll look into it.
Well, it's just a immediate thought.
I didn't do much with Weber either.
Yeah,
no, but I was thinking, just a little bit what Andreas is saying, Weber was writing in a different time, but he was obviously identifying similar processes. So what I'm interested in, maybe if you could expand a little bit on your first point about historical legacies of this, we see there are structural changes here. Competition has been there, and at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, we lived in a world which was also hyper-competitive, and I think that was also sort of reflected in some part of that. And we had theories, similar theories that as sociology is popular today, kind of the Darwinian theories at that time were very popular as well. So I'm thinking, is there a difference? Are we much more competitive now or not? And is there a structural logic to this?
Well, one of the differences is in the understanding of human physiology itself. I mean, there's been some historical work done on that. Some analysts have said, well, there's a sort of paradigm change that happened from the 1930s to the late 1940s, where you move from an understanding of the human body, which was very much in tune with the work of Taylorism. So the idea of the body as a machine with a fixed capacity, which could be made more efficient, which could be maximized through technique. It's very much about Taylorism. If you shovel this way, if you shovel that way, your output will increase, but nevertheless there's this idea that the human body has a fixed capacity. But there was work that started, the Harvard Fatigue Laboratory, goes back to the late 1920s, I think, started to do work on blood, the behaviour of blood at rest, at altitude, under stress. And it started, a different understanding of the human body started to come into effect. People started to look at how you could make the body, not just more efficient, how you can begin to actually enhance the capacity of the body itself. So the science of performance is itself, a contingent part of that set of processes. And really, at the beginning, this was done in the field of industrial relations. That's what this research was about. It didn't really cross over into the world of sport until later, 1950s maybe, early 1960s. In which case, it becomes possible to talk about the science of performance and performance enhancement. So that's one change that that wouldn't have made sense. Think of the human body in that way in the 1920s and 30s. And the other thing is, that the process of medicalization is that, extreme sports, endurance sports, medicine was basically concerned that this would have an atrophying effect. It would actually weaken the population to engage in this type of physical activity. And a lot of this research was happening during the Third Republic in France. There was worry that Germany was more vital, more virile. That their neighbour was they had a stronger, more vital population. France was in a state of degeneration. The population was in a state of decline, and it was considered to be weakened. So there are then those ambiguities as well in the competition.
Yeah, I don't know much about cycling, I'm afraid. It's very interesting what you're saying. But just something more general theory about numbers and the role of numbers in our society. Before I came out, I was just looking, you mentioned the employed, right? I was just looking at the Job Path program, which is basically a bounty hunters who get companies who will place the employed in jobs. And they have all these charts up for, first of all, registration. Then is the person in 3 months, 6 months, and so on. And the unemployed now have a PEX number. In other words, it stands for possibility of employment. And if you're a PEX 5% and you go into the job for 3 months, the bounty hunter, as I would call them, gets so many thousand for placing the person in the job. Now, that regard is as absolutely insane. I would have thought the problem is, why can't we have jobs rather than paying people to be bounty hunters to put people into jobs, and as long as they're there for 3 months, we don't really care what happens to them. There's a certain level of insanity to this. But unfortunately, it pervades our society, as you mentioned with our academic ranking systems. Well, I'm very sad to hear that you let them get away with ranking individuals in Galway against each other. We haven't quite achieved that here yet, but no doubt they'll try to follow your example. But my question really is, right, so it is all pervasive, the reification of numbers and how it's used to essentially dominate. I would say it's competition and control, not competition versus control. We're living in a more bureaucratic society, authoritarian society. That's linked to competition as well. But the question really is, what's the roots of it? That's I think what you're getting at in terms of Max Weber and so on. Now, I would indicate it's into capitalism, but let's explore the idea of something to do with the spirit of rationality. How does one explain this extraordinary pervasion of numbers, whether it's academia, PEX in terms of employed, or the cycling. I mean, it's got to a level of insanity. How does one explain it?
I don't know. Can you? Do you?
but it's not that new. I mean, just throw in. I mean, Sorokin, you know, one of the leading lawyers, started the sociology department at Harvard. He wrote a book, Facts and Foibles, where he talks about numerology, right? One of the signatures of early sociology, that to which you can attach a number of counts and is therefore real. And he kind of went on in this entire book and took out quite a few kind of spoof things that were around and criticized them. So it's and that was written in the 1920s.
Yeah, Nicholas Rose has done some interesting work on numbers as well. I mean, but one of the arguments he makes is that this is intrinsic to democracy and democratization, because it's a way of making things visible and it's a way of making people accountable. And that there's some, there's an intrinsic relationship between democracy and numbers. Which is fine. I mean, so you look at that over a period of 200 years as well, and the genealogy of numbers, if you like. But there's some sort of a threshold which has been crossed in recent decades, where the application of numbers to so many arenas of social and economic life has consequences now that it wouldn't have had in the recent past, I think. So where exactly that threshold lies and how you explain the transition is quite a tricky question to answer, I think. I've looked at some of Michel Foucault's work on neoliberalism, his lectures on neoliberalism, the birth of biopolitics, which it's a fascinating series of lectures, particularly as he wrote them before the new right had really appeared on the political landscape. But he seems to have kind of seen what was coming. But he goes back to the German order liberals in the 1930s and 40s, and the way that they came up with a new theory of competition at that time. And he calls this a type of state phobia that began to emerge. This is for him, this is the beginnings of neoliberalism. So it's not about the state trying to ameliorate the negative effects of the economy, trying to provide jobs for the unemployed, trying to provide welfare for those people who are living in poverty, but how to place the state under the supervision of the market itself, and that gets played out then over several decades, and it's really the new right that takes hold of that then, I think, and really deploys it. But again, where's the threshold here? And how do you explain the transition?
Well, I first of all, on the argument that it has always been there. I mean, there is obviously in science, there's always been emphasis on numbers. The development of science will lead to that. But you would not have conceived in the 1930s that you could measure the throughput in hospitals and the level of care. You wouldn't. That's a different type of idea. So therefore, I think there is a threshold. Is it still a democracy? I'm not sure it's about democracy. Maybe it's birth of the state and the growth of the state, and the states need to impose itself on society. But I would argue two issues, right? One is that, first of all, I think you're right that the ideology of neoliberalism is that it is based on personal choice and freedom and so on. In reality, it goes alongside a very strong bureaucratic and more authoritarian state. So therefore, I think that is one issue, right? And the second issue, I would argue, is more to do with sociology work, but it is that, if you like, the pressure to increase competition in terms of capitalism and so on was originally focused on the manual worker in terms of the factory and so on until the 60s, 70s. And the main focus of a lot of the productivity enhancing measures at the moment is in white collar, office, more nebulous forms of employment in terms of outputs. And therefore the way to do that is through, if you like, numbers, controls, and setting up, as you said, the voluntary acceptance of imposed coercion and so on. This is how it works, right? When do you think white collar people will, if you like, realise this and say it is all nonsense, as against simply internalising the game and continuing it?
Like, I mean, I have a few visiting students in one of my courses at the moment, and this is news to me, but they tell me that when they go for an interview for a job in the United States, in most cases their prospective employer will ask them for their Facebook. Not just that, but the privacy settings as well. And they volunteer that information, they hand that information over. So that, that you're right, but it's not just the state. I mean, it's much more pervasive than that.
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, I'm from the business school, I'm new to UCB, and I came over to listen to you. Well, there's some topics in that which I'm very interested in, and that is the way how management theories over the previous decades have been used and misused and overused in areas for which in fact they have never been developed. If you think about a lot of management theories that have been developed in purely commercial organizations and where they have been used successfully, for whatever reason have been pushed and spilled over into other organizations for which they have actually never been developed, but have been used because of their success in another area. And I've never done that study, but I would be really interested in looking how, I don't know how that could be measured, how that management thinking, based on management theories, based on empirical studies within specific contexts, how that has been, let's say, transferred into areas where it has no real value at all, but it has been used. And that is where you come to situations where actually scientists are being assessed because of the numbers. Because in other areas, the numbers were useful. If you measure markets, it's useful. If you measure scientists, you come into an area for which it has never been developed. So, in my opinion, the introduction of management theory thinking in areas for which they have never been developed, for which the theory has never been developed, is one of the causes. But this is a hypothesis. I'm not sure the proposition. I'm not sure, but it would be very interesting. But I don't know how to measure.
I think Christopher Hood has done some work on that, if I'm not mistaken.
Probably, yeah.
You know, so in the health services, for example, I mean, his complaint seems to be that they don't deliver on what they try to deliver on. So you have situations where people hit the targets but miss the point of the targets, or where they massage the numbers in order to survive the audit. You know, so they engage in what he calls gaming. You know, but you know, if you follow that line of inquiry, I think what you're saying is that there's nothing necessarily wrong with the instruments, what they're trying to do, value for money, transparency, and all this. It's just that they're not working. But nevertheless, there is something that's valuable or worthwhile about moving those instruments from there to there, and trying to make them work, trying to get them to work.
Well, I'm not saying whether there would be more value in another area. In one context, they may be valuable, very much so. The point is that thinking about whether the numbers which have been used in one context may be useful to be used in other contexts is not necessarily true.
But that is not the function of numbers to do that translation work? Partly? I mean, it's not the only reason.
Yeah, of course, but let's take the example of a hospital. If you go to management of a hospital, they don't think in terms of patients, they think in terms of empty beds, which is a complete, well, if you take it from a viewpoint of the patient, it's a worthless discussion. But if you take it from a viewpoint of management, it's a very worthwhile discussion in an empty bed. So it's all about numbers, but the question is, why do you use the numbers for? And with what purpose? I don't have the answer.
I mean, that's the thing, that's the criticism of the work that people like Chris would do, would say, well, okay, it doesn't deliver what it's supposed to deliver on, but actually maybe it's trying to do the wrong thing in the first place, that, you know, value for money is not always necessarily the best principle to use if you're trying to run something like a public health service. Maybe you should have a state-of-the-art health service, even if it costs money, even if it doesn't pay for itself. In which case you shift from empty beds to welfare of patients.
Welfare of patients.
I think with all of this, you have several stakeholders really. So you've got the market and you've got the systems, but then you've got the employer, the employees. I actually work in banking, so we've had, you know, measurement and performance management and bonuses and all that for years. So I looked at it sort of in detail when I did a sociology master's a couple of years ago. And what I kind of eventually came down to was that there's intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So if you're likely to be motivated extrinsically, then you follow all of those bonuses, numbers, belief, all of that stuff. Whereas if you're intrinsically motivated, it's what you're doing is more important than your own feelings about that.
Yeah.
So The Sal's report, I think, which was reported to Barclays Bank, and the collapse of that actually referenced, I think it's intensity that runs in intrinsic and external motivation. And he kind of felt that that was a big factor in the financial crash.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think about this in the context of academia as well, but you can, the extrinsic and the intrinsic can come into conflict as well. You know, that if you agree to play the numbers game because you have to, because if you don't, it's going to be consequences, but you don't take it too seriously, or you don't invest too much time in it, and you focus on what's valuable about the work that you do, your relationship with students, your research, and all of that. But they can encroach on each other where, because that
especially
the numbers
if the
game.
employer feels that, oh, this is the next great thing.
But it starts to take up more and more time to actually comply with the requirements of that numbers game as well, so that it begins to encroach on what you consider to be valuable about what you do. So then you find yourself making these trade-offs, and to think very strategically, should I do this if it's not going to be counted? So we have all these things like workload model forms, and it's not just what gets counted, it's what gets discounted in this type of process as well. If it's discounted, are you going to do it because you're strapped for time anyway? So you can get caught into this tension between the intrinsic and the intrinsic. We have to undergo training in how to be assessed through this performance management system. And our trainer was quite interesting during the session. Initially, this was going to be a 5-point scale, so you're ranked from 1 to 5. Now it's a 3-point scale, it was a 5-point scale. And at one point in the talk I said, hang on, this looks to me very much like a normal distribution. So if you're in the middle, you're going to be doing what you're paid to do. But that's kind of inadequate really, because there's all that room for improvement. And there's much more room to fall behind as well on the 5-point scale. She said actually, she came over from the private sector where these performance systems have been used for years. And I said, what happens to that tail end? Because, if it's a normal distribution, then somebody has to be at the bottom. If you review 100 people, there has to be a certain amount at that negative tail end. And she said, yeah, that would be the requirement in many companies, that you have 10% that come out at the bottom and they get fired. And that's the way it's done. So that pitches you into a really competitive relationship with your peers, because we know that 2 or 3 of us are going to get axed at the end of the year, at the end of this review process. So it gets a bit like the Big Brother household, we pretend that we're friends, but when push comes to shove, you're my enemy, you're my rival. And that kind of mentality that encourages, and even if you don't believe in it, that you have to pay attention to the consequences, I think places the intrinsic and the extrinsic into a real conflict.
There's a lot of internal conflict, I think, when we're working in that context. And then you either combine it or
You can imagine someone who's really lives for their work, really puts their life, puts themselves into it, and they're doing it for whatever reasons, to advance knowledge or to teach students, But it's like now you're kind of stressed, even if you're like that, you're still stressed because you have to pay attention to all this other stuff as well. How am I going to, should I publish in that journal? Because that's not terribly highly ranked journal. And then if you go through, the review processes, well, why are you publishing in these journals with such a low impact factor? Why are you publishing? Is it that you can't publish in the journals with a high impact factor? So then you think strategically, well, I better try and publish in some of the high impact factor journals, even though I prefer to publish in these. And all of that kind of mentality, I think
so
is
is
very...
that going to turn back then, do you think? Is it just going to get more and more pervasive?
That's a very good point, but I think referring to the approach that you have been exposed to when you force people into Gaussian curves, so to speak, even at the end of the year, you really have to push people into fractions within the curve. If you would look for scientific proof or empirical proof that this system actually works, there's no proof. So it is, in fact there's a great book on that specific topic, amongst that topic, in which, I don't know whether you know the book Hard Facts, which is a book written by 2 Harvard professors on the use of management techniques for which there is in fact no scientific ground. And in fact that is the danger. If you think in terms of management theories, and they start to create their own life, and there is spillover in certain areas where techniques are then being developed in order to come to numbers, then of course you come into an area where you use numbers, from which in fact there's no empirical basis for the use. So the only way out, in a way, is to start to challenge this specific mentality, this specific attitude, which is a drama. The same is for leadership theories. If you would count the leadership theories in management that actually predict this type of leadership would be good for innovation, if you would then look for actual empirical proof that shows that this specific leadership profile works in reality, there's no proof. So there's a lot of, you have a management theory, and then there is something that comes out of that management theory that in fact is not based on actual empirical studies. And that is an extreme danger. That is why it works in hospitals, well, why it is used in hospitals, but not necessarily works in hospitals. And that is an extreme danger.
If it has this ideological component, then it's kind of resistant to falsification. If that's what you're trying to do.
Hard facts is a great book to business professors.
I mean, in a way, it's a conflict between counting and judgment, right? I mean, you're farming out the judgment to an operation that's called counting, and that others do. It's very easy to do. While judgment is a much more complicated operation. I mean, you actually would have to read and go through the argument, go through the motion and so on and so forth. But that's not what I wanted to say. I was more, I had another question about the type of sport you were looking at that I think might tell the story, and maybe you could say a few more things about it. So cycling is strange because it is, on one side it's a winner takes it all stuff, on the other side we know they ride in teams. So without a team, you're nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, you refer to that remote control, but then also the other cyclists, who probably in the pecking order might come next. Now I'm not so sure whether that works in more collective forms of team sports.
Like soccer or something.
Well, I know I can see the doping element, in the long run, as we know now over the last 20 years, there have been cases, and it's probably harder to do because of the collective dimension, and then also because of the way football works as a sport. I mean, you have to accelerate, slow down, and do various other things where certain, the drugs might not yet be right to do that, right? So while in this one, it's really, you can go towards the speed and can apply almost mathematical science models to that. I'm not so sure whether you can do that with football. There's too much coincidence, too much luck and other factors involved that you can exclude in sports like cycling. I just want to know your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, there's always been considered a curious sport in that it's a team game, it's a team sport, and yet there's only individuals that stand on the podium at the end. It's not the team that wins, it's the individual that wins. It gets all the glory and the honours and most of the money as well. Someone like, someone that wins the Tour de France would typically share the prize money out with the teammates. That's only one aspect of the earnings that accrues from winning a prestigious race like that. But yeah, they're all assigned a role on the team. Most of them are called domestiques. They're like mules, water carriers, and they shelter the team leader from the rain. That's what they're employed to do. And if they get it into their head that they should have a shot on their own and try and win the race without being given permission, they might find themselves looking for a job the next day. Because we didn't employ you to win the race, we employed you to get him to win the race. So there's a clearly delineated pecking order in the team.
But hence, probably the avant-garde or pilot function of such sports, vis-a-vis probably more team-based sports, I would think. I'm just speculating.
Yeah, avant-garde.
Well, avant-garde in terms of, they can make the first inroads of how science applies to, so-called science applies to sports and vice versa. And then you can do it there in a more straight, more accessible, straightforward way.
Yeah.
There are less hurdles, maybe.
Yeah, well, gymnastics is another sport. It's weightlifting. There's lots of sports where the science of numbers and the drugs are really prevalent. Probably less so in kinds of something like soccer because it's more a game of skill and strength or endurance. But they can still dope to improve their reaction time, for example. So there are ways of enhancing performance through drugs in those sports as well. But you're right, the science of numbers wouldn't have the same application to other sports as would have the science.
Just I really enjoyed the presentation. I was just thinking, I mean, one of the issues you're tracking is the dominance of the numerically based model of evaluation that becomes kind of the default. But the other aspect of that, of course, is the decline of non-numerically based models of assessment and judgment, and it's the point that Grace was making, really. And I wonder if in part that's an important part of the story, to try and chart the decline in basically professional judgment. And why is it that we rely on something that we assume, well, anyone can assess these numbers, they all mean the same to everybody else, that you don't need that extra body of expertise to judge. And in a sense, I wonder, how it fits in with, a very much mass-mediated world where, one of the things that's happened to the professions has been their expertise coming under scrutiny, particularly through a kind of a scandal, outrage model of media coverage, nothing like knocking the bias off their pedestal. And ironically, of course, that was one of the ways in which Armstrong himself was toppled through this kind of extensive legal scrutiny. But so I just wonder, in a sense, you highlight the problem, but if the alternatives, professional judgment, have also been devalued, how do you deal with the residual issues that remain? How do you deal with audit or judgment or assessment in a world where the use of numbers is problematic, but equally perhaps the use of numbers itself has arisen because professional judgment itself came to be undermined?
Yeah, I understand the question that you're asking, and I ask myself it on occasion, but I can't answer it. I don't know how to begin to answer it. It seems to me that's moves more in the direction of the moments of analysis, where there's a trust. Yeah, where you're not just looking at the demise of something, you're also maybe trying to rescue that, or you're saying that given this trajectory, these are the likely consequences of this, and what would be a preferable future to aim for? What would be a preferable sort of social system to live in? And I find it really difficult to do that type of normative analysis. I'm looking at this as a sociologist, as I see myself, and I can't make that leap into the or. I'm looking at the is and the how. These are the questions that I'm struggling with. I understand where you're coming from. And I think, as a person, this really works. As a researcher, I'm not going to go down that road, but as a person, it really works. Both in academia and in sport and other areas of life as well. Where, even in sport, even that little insular world of cycling, it's as if the heart is being ripped out of it, and nobody knows what to do about it. And all of these controls are just making it worse. They're sort of accelerating or intensifying the problem that we're trying to lessen. But just to give you an example, one of the oldest races in the Irish cycling scene is called the Ross. It's an 8-day race. Every year it finishes in Dublin. And it's always been an amateur race. And there's all the legends. It's a bit like the Irish version of the Tour de France. There's all the legends of the Ross, the men of the Ross, and all of that. About 2 years ago, Cycling Ireland decided that they were going to try and rebrand the race. They were going to try and get rid of the cyclists who raced just to try and finish, just to say, I've ridden the Ross and I finished the Ross, I've lived my dream. And this year they went one step further, and they've basically gotten rid of all those riders. Because riders race on licenses, particular licenses, category 1, category 2, down to 4. So 4 is beginners, 1 is elite. So it's only elite riders now that are going to be permitted to ride the Ross. And they've actually said it on their website, we want to get rid of all those county riders who just enter the race in the hope that they might finish it. And to me, that's the lifeblood of the sport, that's the grassroots, the dreamers, the people who dare to try and live their dream. And when you take that out of it, then you take the soul out of something. And I think something similar is happening in academia as well. where you know, to try and answer your question, there's a line from Michel Foucault from one of his interviews that I sometimes think about. I can't find the words myself, so maybe I'll use the words of somebody else. And it goes something like this: he's talking about writing, he's talking about love, and he's talking about life. You know, so he's in life and love and work. The game is only worth playing insofar as you don't know what it will be at the end when you start out. In other words, there's a horizon there of possibilities. If you knew what you were going to be at the end of it, why would you bother to do it? If you knew what you were going to write before you sat down to write it, why would you bother writing it? There's a kind of a process of discovery that happens through the doing of whatever it is. And part of this performance management thing is that you always need to know beforehand what it is that you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and how you're going to get there. And part of that review process is what journals are you going to publish in? What's your research projects for this year? What are your targets? You always have to know in advance. So it kind of closes down that open horizon. That to me is like bringing soda or something that takes the life. It's not a very convincing normative argument. That's why I kind of keep it for myself. But as a human, this is how I feel about it. So this is what's being lost. That's the cost of all of this. How you fix it, how you take it beyond that.
You're depressing our PhD students. There's a hope.
History, the lesson from history is that if we don't fix it, it just breaks down irreparably, it can't be fixed. And something else emerges from the ashes, and maybe that's the way it goes.
Okay, so we'll end up with this one. Thank you very much. Very good.